Hello, everyone. I'm Fred Cobb, and welcome to another edition of Cybersecurity Weekly. And I have my sidekick here with me today, Chad Waddell. Chad is one of our senior security architects, and happy to have him on the show. In the last episode, we talked about patching and the need for patching and how not patching can lead to vulnerabilities and compromise of systems. We're going to continue in that vein with this episode and talk about end-of-life operating systems and applications. I hate to use that term. I prefer end-of-service life. End-of-life sounds a little bit morbid to me personally, but it's commonly known in the industry as end-of-life, and that's whenever an operating system or a piece of firmware or a device reaches a point where the vendor is no longer planning on providing support for that device, and by way of patching or by way of new software release with firmware updates, et cetera. So it's important that we talk about it now because we have just reached a milestone with Microsoft where three very widely used Microsoft, two operating systems and one back office suite application has reached end of service life. So Chad, let's talk a little bit about what those three are, and then we'll talk about some of the things you can do to mitigate risk and what you need to be doing as far as planning upgrades. So take it away.
Yeah, so very important topic. We talked about patching before, and this kind of ties into that as well, because one of the biggest concerns about a operating system or software becoming end of life or end of support is that it will no longer receive security patches. And that's one of the biggest benefits you get from major OEMs and software providers like Microsoft, for example, is that they help release patches to fix those vulnerabilities so that they're not easily exploited. So the examples you brought up, Windows 7 became end of life. So did Server 2008 and its cousin 2008 R2. Also Exchange Server 2010 became end of life as well. Right. So if any of those ring a bell to you, then this should be a concern as far as if it's still in your environment. So that means as of January 14th, 2020, no more security patches. No more vulnerabilities will be fixed, at least out of the box. Like they're not going to provide that to you without maybe paying for some other type of extended support. And these things don't just happen all of a sudden. This is something, for example, with Windows 7, we've known for a decade that it's going to be end of life in 2020. Same thing with Server 2008, same thing with Exchange 2010. These are not surprises. So to kind of take a step back, how can you address these type of end of life for these operating systems and software? Is first of all, you need to plan ahead ideally. So the goal is that if you're deploying an operating system today, if you're deploying a server today, you should be having lifecycle management in place to have it replaced, removed, or upgraded before that end of life. That would be the ideal scenario. But a lot of people are going to have to play catch up. And then there's also software that could be legacy that's on systems as well. So I think that's one of the first ways to address is plan ahead, but then not everyone has that capability, or if they're really becoming aware of this now, then we need to discuss, how can you address that in other ways?
Yeah, no, that's an important point. I mean, we talked about in previous segment about Patch Tuesday and on this 30-day life cycle or patch life cycle,
right?
Patch cycle. Let me say that properly. Sure. That Microsoft is releasing these patches. So all of a sudden you've got, say Windows 7, you've got it deployed throughout your organization on your desktops, on your laptops, and you're not receiving those 30-day patches anymore to take care of security vulnerabilities. So that's a big issue.
Huge.
There are certain circumstances, if you think about certain environments where they may have an old application that's been maybe custom built to run on a certain operating system. Sure. Therein lies a problem with bringing those systems up to current supported operating system levels when you have an application that's critical to the operation environment, but they can't upgrade. In other words, let me give you the example. I've got a Windows 7 on a shop floor, Windows 7 system that's running a CNC machine. It's running a special application. And the CNC manufacturers told me, we're not prepared yet to go to Windows 10.
Right.
What do you do about something like that?
Sure. So there's a couple ways to approach it. So, going back to the first topic that I'll lead into that is ideally you want to be able to replace, remove, or upgrade these systems. So you need to have a plan to take care of those. What if you can't do one of those three things? What if you cannot replace it with a newer system? What if you can't upgrade it to a newer operating system? What if you can't remove it altogether because it's mission critical? You don't always get the opportunities to remove systems. So you need to have what's called compensating controls. So put things in place that will, reduce your risk. So obviously, if you had like Windows 7 in your environment versus Windows 10, that this Windows 7 is going to be way higher risk than Windows 10, just for the fact that it's not being patched anymore. If only that. Obviously, there's other concerns too, but just on that baseline alone. So what you can do is, if let's say it is one of those systems on the floor shop or whatever, does that Windows 7 box need to connect to the internet?
That's a good point.
Yeah. If it doesn't, block internet access. Just if it's not needed, don't introduce that risk. Obviously, the internet's going to be one of the highest risk entities out there that can affect your environment. So remove the internet access. Doesn't need network connectivity. Disconnect it. Reduce your risk if at all possible in many different layers if you can. Now, if it's something that's going to stick around even longer, and maybe it does need network access or internet access, it's going to be really critical to control what can run on those systems. So you might introduce software like Carbon Black, for example.
We'll be back with the Cybersecurity Weekly podcast after we pause for this special message. Security analysts believe cyber attacks will continue to escalate throughout 2020 and are recommending that every company, regardless of industry or size, place immediate focus on cybersecurity training and the tools that will protect you from these attacks. Did you know that you can book a cybersecurity assessment right now with Fred Cobb's team of cybersecurity engineers at Infosystems? They will help you discover exactly where you are most vulnerable to a cyber attack and make recommendations on how to strengthen your defense in those areas. This is urgent. It's an issue that affects everyone in our community. Visit the Infosystems website at www.infosystems.biz to request your cybersecurity assessment. Now back to the podcast.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we did a previous podcast on application whitelisting, and one of our favorite ways to application whitelist at Infosystems, one we highly recommend, is the use of Carbon Black.
Right.
And I'll pause here. Describe again, even though I've already talked about this previously, but for the audience who haven't seen that episode, talk about when you whitelist or when you set up a container or a wrapper around an operating system with Carbon Black. What are you really doing?
So ultimately, first of all, you kind of identified a baseline for that system. And you're looking at what is run on that system, what is mission critical, what is needed. So let's say that software you mentioned that's not ready to move to Windows 10 yet. So you could put Carbon Black on that system and basically say only certain system functions and software that's built into Windows and mission critical software such as that piece of software that's on there is allowed to run. So if you're whitelisting, you're saying this is allowed, but nothing else is allowed to run.
So in that case, to play that thought out, if the system was compromised and a piece of malware was delivered through some method to that system, that malware attempted to execute, Carbon Black is going to block that piece of malware from executing on that system.
And so, so it's going to prevent that from running. And the more if you reduce the overall amount of software that can run on your system, you've obviously reduced your risk because everything that runs on your system, we'll take a step back with that. Everything that runs on a system that's an application or a process or a service that's running is something that needs to be maintained, something that can break, and something that can be exploited. So that's critical. So if you reduce that footprint down to where, okay, only this one application can run on this system, you've dramatically reduced your risk. Now, it's always good to take a step back and look at that system. Can the software run on Windows 10? If it can't, this is your option. You want to try to move things forward. You don't always be kind of content where you're at or, sit back and say, we're just going to run this on Windows 7 for the next 10 years. That's not realistic. You still want to plan ahead, but there are cases where you need to put in compensating controls because that is currently your only option.
And it's scary because, we're out in the field, we're working on customer sites quite often. And again, depending on the industry, more industries are, more cutting edge or trying to stay current versus some of those industries, they're always lagging behind. You have a box sitting there to do a specific task. It does that. Why spend the extra capital investment?
It's not broke, why fix it?
It's not broke, don't fix it. But in the case of an end-of-life operating system, it's very important. You've got to think beyond, well, if it's not broke, don't fix it, because in my opinion, and the opinion of other IT professionals and cyber professionals, once a vulnerability is made public,
Right.
That system is broke.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely.
So you can't say if it's at that point, well, it's not broken. Yes, it is.
Well, because a lot of times it's looked at from the business perspective, right? So the system's running, it's doing what it's meant to do, right? So it's not broke. But from a security perspective, from a risk perspective, that system is broken. Until that's fixed, or in the case of a compensating controls, you can't rule out that system could be exploited. You can't rule out that could be the entry point that takes down your entire environment.
And it's worth mentioning that even though Microsoft puts these operating systems or applications into the category of end of service life or end of life, they do offer extended service contracts, but the fees are typically astronomical for that type of contract. They want you to upgrade.
Yes.
So they hurt you in the wallet.
Right.
If by saying, yeah, we'll continue to support this. If you really want us to, it's going to cost you a huge sum of money. So in all my dealings with customers throughout the years, I can't say I've ever seen a situation where they have paid for an extended service contract because a system has reached end of service life due to the cost. But, you and I, we both know we visit customer sites. We still see Windows XP systems. We see Windows 2003 systems. The customers that have these on their networks are at extreme risk unless they've done something like application whitelisting.
Those systems are on life support. I mean, and the thing is, there's a lot of cases where you come in, this first time we've worked with a certain customer or client, and they've got these really vulnerable systems, and it's been running for 10 years, and it's on the same hardware, and it's like, do you have a backup image of this system or any compensating controls? And if the answer is no, that's a huge concern. So the goal is not to say, oh, no, you need to buy more stuff, or, you need to get all this stuff upgraded just because. No, there's lots of good reasons behind it. And the end of life is a good indicator for a system to plan ahead, or if you already have an end-of-life system, to move forward. And in most cases, you can move the software forward. You can move whatever is critical on that old system forward. But there are cases where you can't, at least not right this second, and that's where the compensating controls come back into play. So really, that's just talking about the options for the end users, for the organizations out there. Is if you have end-of-life systems, replace it. Remove it, upgrade it, or do the compensating controls. If you do one of those four things, you're going to be ahead of the curve.
Okay. Chad, great intel. Appreciate you sharing your thoughts on end-of-life operating systems. And again, it's very urgent that if you have Windows 7, Windows 2008, Windows 2008 R2, Exchange 2010 still running in your environment, that you create a plan to either upgrade or replace or provide some sort of compensating control around those applications or operating systems.
Yep, it's critical.
Appreciate you tuning in to Cybersecurity Weekly. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode. We've got some good information coming up around firewalls, what they do, what they don't do, and can't wait to share that information with you. Thanks again for tuning in.
Thank you.
Goodbye.